A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I will begin this series with unsolved murders, but I will also revisit cases that include arrests because aspects of the case are worth re-examining. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. Thanks for joining me today. Many people draw comfort and guidance from reading the Bible, but I want to share a sad story of a man who could have used just a few words to guide his murderous misunderstanding. Episode 40, Heaven Bound. A couple started attending a small church outside of Oak Hill. Then one Wednesday before prayer meeting, Billie Jean Yarber told her young pastor she wanted to be saved. Her husband, Dennis Leon Yarber, told the pastor that he too wanted to be saved. The Reverend Tim Skaggs prayed with the couple in his study. Now that they were saved, Yarber asked Reverend Skaggs, would they go to heaven? Reverend Skaggs assured him that after Christians leave their bodies, they will go to heaven with God. With some urgency, Yarber asked, if they died tonight, would we go to heaven? Reverend Skaggs reassured him that Christians are heaven-bound. The two left the church after the Wednesday evening prayer service. About 45 minutes later, Billie was dead, murdered by her husband. In court, we learned that the couple with their 3 children left church and went to the home of Yarber's brother Craig. The children were outside with their uncle, and their aunt stepped into the kitchen. Billie Jean and Dennis were in the living room talking. Diane Yarber would go on to testify that suddenly Dennis Yarber was holding his wife by the hair and pointing a knife at her. She ran to get her husband, and Craig found the couple on the floor struggling. He saw his sister-in-law covered in blood and a bent knife from the kitchen chopping block lying on the kitchen floor about 15 feet away. Craig pulled his brother off of the bleeding Billie Jean, but his brother grabbed a second knife in the kitchen and stabbed his wife in the throat with it. Dennis threw his brother out the front door, and his brother left in his car. Later, after an autopsy was performed on the victim, the state medical examiner found 8 stab wounds. Several of these wounds were to her thorax and abdomen. Several people close to the couple also believed that Yarber planned to kill himself too. When I first wrote this story, many religious leaders and people who advocate for victims of domestic violence wanted their voices to be heard. I wrote follow-up stories. One counselor told me that he thought in our Appalachian culture, men believe that their wives are their property. They take one passage of scripture and distort the whole notion of submission. Andy Counts, a licensed counselor in Charleston, told me. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he wrote, "Wives, submit yourself to your husbands as unto God." But Counts pointed out that as you read on in chapter 5, Paul writes that husbands and wives should submit to each other. The entire chapter 5 is worth reading, but I want to point out a few verses. In verses 25 to 28 from chapter 5, Paul also wrote, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." Pastors and counselors I interviewed made the point that Paul is saying a husband will love his wife as much as he loves himself and as much as Christ loved the church. That represents a huge amount of love. Both counselors and pastors also pointed out to me that there is no justification for domestic violence in the Bible. Was Yarber acting with a fervent spirit, ready to send his wife to heaven with plans to follow her, or did he have mental health issues? In other court hearings that I covered, his lawyer, Jack Thompson, pointed out that when Yarber got the correct medication, he looked and acted differently. In In this case, Thompson considered an insanity defense. Thompson also had to weigh the impact on the jury of hearing Reverend Skaggs testify that Yarber asked if they would go to heaven immediately after they were saved. Thompson said jurors could easily think that was premeditation on Yarber's part. Premeditated murder could mean a life sentence in prison. Ultimately, Yarber entered a plea to first-degree murder without admitting his guilt. His sentence included a recommendation of mercy from the prosecutor. The law allows a plea without admitting guilt if the defendant believes he could face a longer sentence if he went to trial. Another tragic aspect of this case is the children. They were in the yard while their mother was being murdered. They heard her screaming. Their mother's sister was able to get custody of them. Because Yarber entered a plea, the case did not come to trial. Many people were glad that the children did not have to relive their mother's murder in court. Thanks, as always, for listening, to Tommy Siner for his always great work, and to Brenda Pinnell for her amazing technical skills. Please join me next Wednesday for another episode of A Real Crime with Susan Williams.